5 years ago, I believed my life was over. Not because I was dying, but because I could no longer remember who I was. Those were the words Charlotte Bennett spoke softly into the microphone as hundreds of people sat in complete silence. Moments earlier, the audience inside the art gallery in Portland, Maine had risen to their feet in applause. The sound had echoed through the hall, filling every corner of the room. Yet Charlotte seemed almost surprised by it. She stood beneath the warm lights with her silver hair neatly pinned back, her hands folded gently in front of her, and her eyes fixed on the painting displayed behind her. The painting was called Second Spring. At its center sat a simple wooden chair beside a large window overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Golden sunlight poured through the glass, illuminating the empty seat. To most visitors, it looked like a peaceful coastal scene. To Charlotte, it was the story of an entire lifetime. The host smiled and asked if she would like to say a few words about the painting. Charlotte looked at the chair for several seconds before answering. "It's never too late." The room fell completely still. Some people smiled. Others quietly wiped away tears. None of them could have imagined the woman standing on that stage 5 years earlier. The truth was, Charlotte could not have imagined it either. At 66 years old, she had spent most of her life caring for other people. She married young, raised 2 children, supported her husband through every success and every setback, and built a home filled with warmth and routine. For more than 4 decades, her identity had been woven into the lives of those she loved. She never questioned it. She never regretted it. She believed that was exactly what life was supposed to be. Then everything changed. Her children moved away to pursue careers and families of their own. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became occasional holidays. And when her husband passed away after a long illness, the silence that settled over her home felt heavier than anything she had ever experienced. The house that once overflowed with conversation now seemed impossibly large. Every room carried a memory. Every object reminded her of a life that no longer existed. Some evenings, she would sit alone and listen to the old clock in the hallway ticking through the darkness. The sound felt louder than her own thoughts. Day after day, she followed the same routine without knowing why. Coffee in the morning. Television in the afternoon. A quiet dinner for one. Then another night staring out the window at the ocean beyond the cliffs. She wasn't unhappy exactly. She was simply lost. For the first time in her life, no one needed her. And without realizing it, she had begun to wonder whether her story had already reached its final chapter. What Charlotte did not know was that a forgotten dream was waiting for her. Hidden beneath decades of responsibility. Buried inside a dusty box she had not opened since high school. And within a matter of weeks, that discovery would lead her toward a future she never thought possible. A future that would eventually bring her right back to this stage, standing before a crowd of strangers, with a painting behind her and a life she had almost given up on transformed forever. The following morning looked exactly like the one before it. And that was part of the problem. Charlotte woke up at 6:30, brewed a pot of coffee, and stood alone in her kitchen listening to the distant cry of seagulls drifting in from the coast. The small house overlooking the water had once felt alive from sunrise until bedtime. Now every sound seemed isolated. The refrigerator hummed. The floorboards creaked. The clock in the hallway continued its steady march forward. She carried her coffee to the dining room table and sat in the same chair she always chose, though there was no longer anyone sitting across from her. For more than 40 years, mornings had followed a rhythm shared with another person. Conversations about the weather. Plans for the day. Small observations that seemed unimportant at the time. Only after they disappeared did she realize how much those ordinary moments had meant. Outside the window, the Atlantic stretched toward the horizon beneath a pale gray sky. Fishing boats moved slowly through the harbor. Life continued. It always did. Yet Charlotte often felt as though she had been left standing still while everything else kept moving. Her children called when they could. They loved her. She never doubted that. But they had lives of their own now. Careers. Homes. Grandchildren. Their world no longer revolved around the house where they had grown up. Sometimes days passed without hearing another voice in person. She filled the silence with television programs she barely watched and books she struggled to finish. In the afternoons she often sat beside the wooden chair near the living room window. The chair had belonged to her husband. It faced the ocean, exactly where he liked it. During the final years of his life, he spent countless evenings there reading while the sun disappeared beyond the water. After he was gone, Charlotte could never bring herself to move it. The chair remained where it had always been, untouched, almost sacred. Some evenings she would sit beside it and watch the sunset paint the room in shades of gold and orange. Other evenings she simply stared at it, feeling as though a part of her life still occupied that empty space. As the months passed, a strange question began following her everywhere. It appeared while folding laundry, while washing dishes, while staring out at the ocean. Who am I now? For decades the answer had been simple. She was a wife, a mother, a caretaker. Someone needed her every day. Now those roles felt distant, like photographs stored in a forgotten drawer. She loved the life she had built. She would not trade those years for anything. Yet somewhere beneath the responsibilities and routines, another version of herself had quietly disappeared. Charlotte did not know it yet, but the answer she was searching for had been waiting above her head for nearly 50 years. Hidden inside a dusty attic filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. And before the week was over, a rainy afternoon would lead her there. The rain arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Thick clouds rolled in from the ocean, turning the water beyond Charlotte's window into a sheet of gray steel. It was the kind of day that seemed designed for staying indoors. After lunch, she decided to tackle a project she had been postponing for years. The attic. She climbed the narrow staircase carrying a flashlight and a cardboard box for donations. Dust floated through the beams of light as she opened the small attic door. The space smelled of old wood, forgotten seasons, and memories packed away long ago. Boxes lined the walls. Holiday decorations. Children's school projects. Stacks of photo albums. Charlotte moved slowly from one corner to another, sorting through decades of family history. Every object seemed connected to a different version of her life. A small baseball glove that had belonged to her son. A faded ballet program from her daughter's recital. Handwritten Christmas cards. Receipts from vacations she had almost forgotten. Hours passed without her noticing. Then, tucked behind a stack of old blankets, she found a small blue storage box covered in dust. She did not recognize it at first. Curious, she carried it closer to the window and brushed away the dirt. Her breath caught slightly when she opened the lid. Inside were notebooks. Sketchbooks. Loose sheets of yellowing paper. For a moment she simply stared. Then she carefully lifted the first notebook and opened it. Pencil drawings filled the pages. Lighthouses. Seagulls. Harbor scenes. Portraits of classmates. Some were clumsy. Others showed surprising skill. Charlotte felt as though she were looking at the work of a stranger. Yet every page belonged to her. Near the back of one sketchbook, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. She picked it up and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though written by a much younger hand. At the top of the page, 16-year-old Charlotte had written a simple sentence. "One day I want to become an artist." She read the words again. Then a third time. Memories surfaced from places she had not visited in decades. She remembered sitting by classroom windows drawing instead of taking notes. She remembered filling notebooks with sketches during summer vacations. She remembered telling friends that one day she would have paintings hanging in galleries. Somewhere along the way, life had become busy. Then, responsibilities arrived. Marriage. Children. Bills. Schedules. The dream had not disappeared overnight. It had simply been set aside 1 year at a time until nearly 50 years had passed. Charlotte lowered herself onto an old trunk and sat quietly with the notebook resting in her lap. Outside, rain tapped softly against the roof. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the sadness and routine. Curiosity. The girl who wrote those words had vanished long ago. Or so Charlotte had believed. Yet sitting alone in that dusty attic, she suddenly wondered whether that girl had been waiting patiently all along. Waiting for the moment when someone finally remembered she existed. For the next several days, the notebook never left Charlotte's side. She placed it on the kitchen table during breakfast. She carried it into the living room during the evening. Sometimes she opened it simply to look at the sketches for a few minutes before closing it again. The drawings were not extraordinary. They were the work of a teenager learning through trial and error. Yet every page reminded her of something she had forgotten. There had once been a time when she created things simply because she loved doing it. No deadlines. No responsibilities. No expectations. Just curiosity. One afternoon, while searching online for local art classes, she nearly closed her laptop 3 different times. The idea felt ridiculous. She was 66 years old. Most people her age were downsizing their lives, not beginning entirely new chapters. The voice inside her head was quick to list reasons why it was a bad idea. She had no formal training. She had not picked up a paintbrush in decades. She would probably be the oldest person in the room. What if she embarrassed herself? What if she failed? Yet another thought kept returning. What if she did not? A few miles outside town, near a rocky stretch of coastline, she found a small place called the Harbor Light Studio. The building appeared in the photographs like something from another era. A weathered white structure facing the ocean. Large windows. Wooden floors. Easels scattered throughout bright rooms. Filled with sunlight. At the bottom of the page was the name of the owner and instructor. Eleanor Whitmore. Charlotte hesitated for nearly 10 minutes before finally completing the registration form. When the confirmation email arrived in her inbox, her heart began beating faster than she expected. The first class was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. During the days leading up to it, she found herself unusually nervous. On Monday evening she stood in front of her closet wondering what someone was supposed to wear to an art class. The question made her laugh out loud. It was the first spontaneous laugh she could remember having in months. Tuesday arrived with clear skies and cool ocean air. Charlotte drove along the coastal road with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The closer she came to the studio, the more uncertain she felt. She almost turned around twice. By the time she parked outside the building, she was convinced she had made a mistake. But then she noticed something through the large front window. People laughing. People talking. People carrying sketchbooks and paint supplies. None of them looked concerned about being perfect. None of them seemed worried about being judged. Charlotte sat in her car for another minute watching the activity inside. Then she took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out into the crisp Maine morning. She did not know it yet, but the decision to walk through that front door would eventually change every part of her life. And somewhere inside the studio, waiting beyond the smell of paint and ocean air, was a woman named Eleanor Whitmore who was about to say a single sentence that Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life. The moment Charlotte stepped inside, she was greeted by the scent of paint, aged wood, and salt air drifting through the open windows. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, illuminating easels arranged throughout the room. Conversations paused briefly as newcomers arrived, then resumed with easy warmth. No one seemed concerned about talent or experience. They simply looked happy to be there. Charlotte clutched the small sketchbook she had purchased the day before and quietly found a seat near the back. A few minutes later, a woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes walked to the center of the room. She carried herself with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. This was Eleanor Whitmore. She welcomed everyone, introduced herself, and spent several minutes chatting casually before the lesson began. Charlotte felt some of her nervousness fade. Then came the first assignment. A simple still life placed on a table near the windows. Nothing complicated. A ceramic bowl, a small lantern, and a seashell. Eleanor asked everyone to sketch what they saw. Charlotte stared at the blank page in front of her. Her hand felt strangely stiff as she picked up the pencil. The first lines looked awkward. The proportions were wrong. The shell resembled a crumpled napkin more than anything found on a beach. Frustration arrived almost immediately. Around her, other students seemed to move with ease. She considered closing the sketchbook altogether. Then, while reaching for an eraser, she accidentally knocked over her container of pencils. They scattered across the floor with a loud clatter. Several heads turned. Charlotte felt her face grow warm with embarrassment. Before she could apologize, Eleanor walked over and knelt beside her to help gather the pencils. Charlotte expected reassurance. Instead, Eleanor smiled and said something unexpected. "Your first drawing does not need to be beautiful. It only needs to exist." Charlotte blinked. Eleanor placed the pencils back on the table and continued speaking. Most people never start because they are afraid of making something imperfect. The secret is that every artist begins with imperfect work. Every single one. Then she simply walked away and continued teaching. The words lingered in Charlotte's mind for the rest of the morning. Your first drawing does not need to be beautiful. It only needs to exist. For years she had judged herself before allowing herself to begin. She had assumed that if she could not be good immediately, there was little point in trying. Yet the people around her seemed to understand something she had forgotten. Learning was supposed to be messy. Growth was supposed to feel uncomfortable. By the end of class, her sketch was still far from impressive. The bowl leaned slightly to one side. The lantern looked uneven. The shell remained questionable. Yet for the first time in a very long while, Charlotte felt proud of something she had done purely for herself. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon breeze, she noticed the ocean sparkling beyond the cliffs. The world looked exactly the same as it had that morning. But somehow, she did not feel exactly the same. A small door had opened inside her, and for the first time in years, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Charlotte had not experienced in years. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning she drove along the coast to the studio, arriving a little earlier each time. The fear that had accompanied her during the first class slowly gave way to anticipation. She began carrying a sketchbook wherever she went. If she stopped at the harbor, she sketched fishing boats. If she sat in a coffee shop, she sketched the people reading newspapers by the window. The world seemed fuller somehow, as though details she had overlooked for decades were suddenly impossible to ignore. Eleanor often reminded the class that artists learn to see before they learn to paint. Charlotte finally understood what she meant. The curve of a shoreline. The reflection of sunlight on water. The weathered texture of a wooden fence. Ordinary things began revealing unexpected beauty. Along the way she also found something she had not expected to find. Friendship. Harold Dawson, a retired firefighter with a quick laugh and a habit of arriving with coffee for everyone, often worked at the easel beside hers. Martha Collins, a grandmother in her early 70s, loved watercolor landscapes and never missed an opportunity to encourage other students. Conversations started during class and continued afterward at nearby cafes overlooking the ocean. For the first time since losing her husband, Charlotte felt connected to people who understood what it meant to begin again. Months passed. Seasons changed. Her skills improved slowly, almost too slowly to notice. Then one afternoon Eleanor walked behind her easel and stopped. Charlotte had been working on a painting inspired by the wooden chair near her living room window. The chair appeared simple, yet she returned to it again and again. It reminded her of loss, memory, and quiet endurance. Eleanor studied the painting for several moments before speaking. "You keep coming back to this chair," she said. Charlotte nodded. "I suppose I do." Eleanor smiled. "That usually means it is trying to tell you something." The comment stayed with her long after class ended. Over the following year, the chair became the center of several paintings. Sometimes it faced the ocean. Sometimes it sat in warm afternoon light. Sometimes it stood alone against the glow of a setting sun. Each version seemed to capture a different part of her journey. Then came an opportunity she never expected. A regional art exhibition announced an open submission period for local artists. Students throughout the studio immediately began discussing which pieces they planned to enter. Charlotte dismissed the idea at first. The exhibition attracted talented painters from across the state. She still considered herself a beginner. But Eleanor disagreed. "You are not submitting because you expect approval," she told her. "You are submitting because your work deserves to leave the room." After several days of hesitation, Charlotte selected her favorite painting of the chair by the window and completed the application. When she finally mailed the package, she felt equal parts excitement and terror. For weeks she checked her mailbox every afternoon. Then one cloudy morning, an envelope arrived. The moment she saw it resting among the bills and advertisements, her stomach tightened. She carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a very long time before gathering the courage to open it. The letter was polite, professional, brief. Charlotte knew the answer before she finished reading the second paragraph. The exhibition committee thanked her for her submission and wished her continued success in her artistic journey. Her painting had not been selected. That was all. No criticism. No detailed explanation. Just a quiet rejection folded neatly onto a single sheet of paper. She sat at the kitchen table staring at the words long after she had finished reading them. Outside, the ocean rolled steadily toward the shore. Inside, the room felt strangely small. For most people, it would have been a minor disappointment. For Charlotte, it felt far larger. This was the first dream she had pursued entirely for herself in nearly 50 years. She had allowed herself to hope. She had imagined, however cautiously, that perhaps she belonged among real artists. Now the old doubts returned with surprising force. Maybe she had started too late. Maybe the voice inside her had been right all along. During the following weeks, she stopped painting. The easel in her living room stood untouched. Brushes remained in their container. Sketchbooks stayed closed. She still attended classes occasionally, but the excitement that once carried her through the studio doors had faded. Even Harold noticed. One afternoon he sat beside her after class and asked if everything was all right. Charlotte smiled and said she was simply tired. It was easier than explaining the truth. Meanwhile, the studio faced problems of its own. Enrollment had declined during the past year. Rising expenses made it increasingly difficult to keep the doors open. Conversations about budgets and fundraising began replacing discussions about new classes and community events. Although Eleanor remained optimistic, Charlotte could see the concern behind her smile. The place that had given so much to so many people suddenly seemed fragile. One rainy afternoon, nearly a month after receiving the rejection letter, Charlotte returned to the studio to collect a few supplies she had left behind. She expected the building to be empty. Instead, as she stepped through the front door, she froze. Something had changed. Along the main wall of the largest room hung dozens of photographs, sketches, paintings, and handwritten notes. At the center of the display was a familiar image. Her painting. The same painting that had been rejected. Charlotte stared at it in disbelief. Slowly, she walked closer. Around the frame were handwritten messages attached with small pins. One note from Harold explained that seeing her determination had inspired him to begin painting after 30 years of telling himself he was too busy. Another from Martha described how Charlotte's quiet persistence reminded her that learning never had an expiration date. More notes covered the wall. Some were funny. Some were heartfelt. Some were only a sentence long. Yet together they told a story Charlotte had never seen before. A story about encouragement. About courage. About second chances. She stood there reading every message while tears gathered quietly in her eyes. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Eleanor approached and rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "When you first arrived here," she said softly, "you thought this place was helping you. What you never realized is that you have been helping all of us too." The weeks that followed transformed the studio in ways none of them had expected. What began as a simple display of encouragement quickly became something much larger. Students organized small community events. Local businesses donated supplies. Residents who had never painted a single picture stopped by simply to offer support. The studio became more than a place to learn art. It became a gathering place for people searching for connection, purpose, and friendship. Charlotte found herself spending more time there than at home. She helped organize workshops, greeted new students, and occasionally shared her own experiences with those who felt nervous about starting. Yet despite the growing sense of optimism, uncertainty still lingered beneath the surface. Then one autumn afternoon, Eleanor asked Charlotte to stay after class. The room was quiet once everyone else had left. Sunlight stretched across the floorboards as Eleanor sat beside the window looking out toward the ocean. For a moment neither woman spoke. Finally, Eleanor explained that recent medical tests had revealed a serious health condition requiring extensive treatment. She would need to step away from teaching indefinitely. Charlotte listened in stunned silence. The thought of the studio without Eleanor felt impossible. This place existed because of her vision, her patience, and her belief in people. Then Eleanor reached into her bag and placed a small ring of keys on the table between them. Charlotte immediately understood what was happening. Eleanor wanted her to take over the classes. The suggestion felt absurd. Charlotte shook her head before Eleanor even finished speaking. She was not qualified. She was still learning herself. There were countless people better suited for the responsibility. Eleanor listened patiently. Then she smiled. 5 years ago, you believed you had nothing left to offer. You were wrong then, and you are wrong now. But Charlotte could not accept it. She left the keys on the table and drove home feeling overwhelmed. That evening she sat beside the familiar wooden chair near her window and watched darkness settle over the ocean. Every fear she thought she had overcome returned at once. What if she disappointed everyone? What if she failed? What if the studio collapsed because she was not capable enough to lead it? Over the next several days she avoided the studio entirely. Calls from friends went unanswered. Emails remained unread. The building stayed closed. Then one cold morning, someone knocked on her front door. Standing outside was an elderly woman Charlotte had never met before. Her name was Rose Parker. She explained that she had recently lost her husband and had heard about the studio from a neighbor. She wanted to learn how to paint. When Charlotte gently explained that classes were no longer being offered, disappointment crossed Rose's face. She nodded politely and turned to leave. Then she paused. "That is unfortunate," she said softly. "I finally worked up the courage to begin something new." Charlotte stood frozen as the woman walked back toward her car. The words followed her long after the driveway was empty. Because 5 years earlier, she had been standing in exactly the same place, searching for exactly the same courage. The next morning Charlotte drove to the studio before she had time to change her mind. The coastal air was cool, and a thin layer of fog drifted above the water. When she unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of paint and salt air greeted her. For a moment she simply stood there listening to the quiet. The room felt different now. Not empty. Waiting. She walked to the table where Eleanor had left the keys weeks earlier. They were still there. Charlotte picked them up and slipped them into her pocket. It was a small action, but it felt like crossing an invisible line. Within days the classes resumed. The first session was far from perfect. Charlotte stumbled through introductions, lost track of time, and worried constantly that she was doing everything wrong. Yet the students did not seem to care. They came because they wanted to learn, create, and spend time with people who understood them. Rose Parker sat in the front row during every class. Harold continued bringing coffee. Martha helped organize supplies. Slowly, the community carried itself forward. Months passed. New students arrived. Some were recently retired. Others had spent years caring for family members and finally wanted to pursue interests of their own. A few had never held a paintbrush before. Charlotte recognized pieces of her own story in nearly all of them. Whenever someone apologized for being inexperienced, she found herself repeating the words Eleanor had once said to her. Your first drawing does not need to be beautiful. It only needs to exist. The studio grew stronger with each season. Local newspapers featured stories about the classes. Community events attracted visitors from neighboring towns. What had once seemed fragile became one of the most beloved gathering places along the coast. Through it all, Charlotte continued painting. The wooden chair by the window remained her favorite subject. Over time it became more than a piece of furniture. It became a symbol of grief transformed into gratitude, loneliness transformed into connection, and endings transformed into beginnings. Then came the exhibition in Portland. The same type of event that had once rejected her work. This time, one of her paintings was selected for the center display. On the evening of the opening, visitors filled the gallery. Conversations echoed through the room as people studied the artwork. When the announcement was made and Charlotte's name was called, the audience rose to their feet. She walked slowly toward the stage, hardly believing what she was seeing. Behind her hung the painting that would later become known as Second Spring. At its center sat the familiar wooden chair beside a sunlit window overlooking the ocean. The host asked if she wanted to share a few words. Charlotte looked at the painting and thought about everything that had led her there. The quiet house. The dusty attic. The first nervous class. The rejection letter. The wall covered with notes. Eleanor. Rose. Every person who had helped her discover a life she never expected to find. Then she smiled and spoke the simplest truth she knew. It is never too late. Years later, visitors would still see those words displayed on a small plaque inside the studio. And each evening, after the final class ended and the students went home, Charlotte would sit beside the window as sunlight spilled across the floorboards. Beyond the glass, seagulls drifted over the water and waves rolled steadily toward shore. The chair remained there, unchanged. But the woman sitting beside it was no longer waiting for life to begin. She was living it.